going to start with you, Anita. Because one thing I want to focus on is the character of Homer, who in the film, is struggling with his disability and how to sort of reintegrate into his life. And I think as we see his evolution through the film, it becomes evident that a large part of how he'll be able to move forward has to do with really his attitude, I think, and his outlook, and sort of, being able to be vulnerable as well as, not to mention the support of Wilma and being able to feel a sense of acceptance from her. So in some ways, his positive embrace of rehabilitation and so to speak. So I'm curious for you how the way that he copes with his new prostheses compares to your experience, I guess, with patients. Yeah.
I think that's a really good question. Is this on?
Yeah, if you hold it a little closer.
Hold it closer.
Yeah.
Okay. It's true that in rehabilitation, that even though it's a physical injury, there's still all these psychosocial components that are impacting his life and returning to his life. So he's dealing with what's it like to be disabled when he wasn't disabled before. Being a bilateral or two-arm amputee is much more complicated than one arm, so he really is relying on other people for doing so many things. But he's also lost each of the roles that he had. So as a son, his role has changed. As a boyfriend, it's changed. As a worker, it's changed. So he's dealing with so many different changes in himself. And then the other thing that people are dealing with is how that impacts other people. So any self-esteem, any power, any control that he had is also changing. So the two go really hand in hand, that you can't forget about one without the other. And this thing that seems to help a lot in rehabilitation is meeting other people who have been in similar circumstances, or circumstances that you can kind of pull out similar sorts of feelings. And what he's able to do is use the people around him. So Hoagie Carmichael, the uncle in the piano bar, I think does a really good job of making playing a duet part of a normal routine. And they adapt the way that he does play the piano, but it's still a piano song and it's enjoyable. And that's part of that action of coming back into feeling okay about yourself.
That's great. So David, I also wanted to ask you, so in case, for those of you who don't know, this film was actually commissioned by Samuel Goldwyn, who was the producer who in 1944 was thinking about, the war was ending and he was thinking about what he wanted, and he basically thought that he wanted a movie that was post-war, that was about the difficulties of social reintegration. So for you, I'm curious what you think the film communicates about the perhaps ideals or expectations, I guess, of veterans, and maybe specifically those with disabilities. But yeah.
Sure. Well, sometimes when big studios make a film, sometimes it's called a statement film, and this is definitely a great example of a statement film. So that a big studio, which releases lots of movies during the course of a year, will make a film where they are trying to kind of capture the zeitgeist, trying to capture something about this moment. And the fact that this was being planned before the war ended, and the fact that it went into production before the war ended and it comes out in 1946, everything about it is designed to capture as much as possible what is going on. So there are lots of, in addition to the disability themes that Homer represents, that Anita was referring to, all of the other questions, the economic questions, the kind of existential questions. Are we going to go to war again? Maybe it doesn't matter because the bomb is going to be dropped and we're all going to be, incinerated tomorrow. So there's all these things that are sort of percolating in the culture at the time that then get kind of targeted around these three figures who represent, a cross-section of this little town, Boone City, which apparently has a fantastic nightlife. It was like one of the sequences of like Manhattan in the 40s, like Boone City. Who knew that it had such a vibrant, sort of nightlife. Every Carmen Randall lookalikes are going there. there's this way in which Homer and what he is experiencing and dealing with sort of is, as sometimes is said in film scholarship, kind of a metonym, sort of a stand-in for things that both Fred and Al are going through, but in very different ways. This idea that they occupied a particular position in the military, status, as well as respect. The very first image is of Fred being bumped by the rich guy who can get onto the plane because he has the money, but veteran status obviously doesn't count for anything in this new civilian world. The one last thing I'll say is, when I have taught this film or written about this film, I've been so focused on Homer. But it really occurred to me in watching this film, and I haven't seen it for several years, that sort of penultimate scene in the film where Fred is walking through this sort of graveyard of planes. Yeah. And in a way, it is as much a metonym for what exactly is happening, right? The uselessness or perceived uselessness of these guys who are now back in the civilian world. They can't get a job, or they have a hard time integrating. They are afraid of how their masculinity will be impacted by their disabilities. And what's happening to these planes? Well, they're going to be scrap metal for prefab houses out in Levittowns, or the equivalents of Levittowns. That's the world that has now been brought forward by the post-war era. So where do these guys even fit in? So that scene is very haunting in lots of ways. But I think it kind of does go to this idea that what Homer is experiencing is kind of in his own private way what these guys are experiencing sort of in their own respective worlds.
Yeah, and so I wonder whether either of you knows anything about this, but obviously war and veterans are still very present in our society, and my understanding is that the military helps to develop prosthetics or prostheses in terms of like the actual engineering and technology and all of that, and I'm interested in this sort of dual use. In one instance for augmented ability, let's say, of people who don't have a disability, and then in the other instance for this sort of supplementary or replacing an already, a body function that needs to be replaced. And so it's for either of you. If either of you wants to expand a little bit on that history, I'm particularly interested in the sort of identity of ability, versus disability. I think, David, in your book, you mentioned about cyborgs and veterans, and maybe that there are some similarities there with people with prostheses. I don't want to go too much into that, but I do think there's an interesting thing perhaps to talk about with this idea of, people who have these, even when Homer's joke at the soda jerk, like, oh, well, these are I just was sick of these old hands, and like, these are the newest. So along that lines of sort of, do you have any?
I can start with it. I'm going to kind of weave in and out of what you're talking about. It's true that a lot of the funding for similar research is still coming from the Defense Department, and it's used in multiple ways. So it's used for rehabilitation of people who need it, and it really is cutting edge of what then kind of trickles down to other people in the community. But it also is used, the thought behind it is used in preparation for defense. Mm-hmm. So with the development of exoskeletons for people with spinal cord injury who can't walk, it gives them the ability to walk. But for soldiers who have limited strength, it makes them super strong. So it's the same sort of technology that is used in multiple ways. And I do have to say also that the VA also leads in funding equipment like this for the veterans. So veterans tend to get really good services and really good equipment, and that also kind of makes the norm or trickles down to the rest of the population. I'm not really sure how that all started, but I do know that much of the rehab field is because of returning veterans. So much of what we've learned about rehabilitation of all people has been with working with veterans who have returned from war. The way that I look at things, it's still focusing on function. So what are the functional abilities that the person has lost or are impaired, and what can we do to build that back up. So it really is about getting people back to being able to participate in those activities that they want to.
Do you have anything?
Yeah, well, I would say, one thing that probably crosses over between the work I do and the work Anita does is this distinction I think you're drawing attention to between, let's say, what are called rehabilitation or restoration technologies, right? So to be able to give someone who lost a particular kinds of function, restore that in some way. And then what are often called enhancement technologies, right, which aren't necessarily related to disability, but are meant to exceed what the human body can do. And so there's this very strange slippage between those. There are people who are interested in being able to restore a function so they can do work, so they can take care of children, so they can take care of themselves. Mm-hmm. And that's a very different set of expectations or a different set of desires than someone who wants to exceed what's possible.
Right.
And some of the fantasies about cyborgs and robots and artificial intelligence isn't necessarily about people with disabilities. It's about people kind of fantasizing about what the future of the human body might look like. And some of that might be related to it. But my interest has always been in not so much the fantasies of what the human body can do, but just really being able to provide people with ways for them to become independent, mm-hmm, and to not glamorize it as if everybody has the potential to be RoboCop or some kind of cyborg fantasy, but instead to be able to give people the capacity to do what they need to do. And that's a bit more, mm-hmm, it's not a very glamorous, or science fiction-y desire. No. It's actually a very ordinary desire. So thinking about the differences between those areas, I think is kind of important to hang on to.
Yeah. Well, so in your estimation, how does the film do in terms of like giving that sort of accurate or portrayal? I mean, as Weiler said, like he wanted to really just show the struggles of ordinary people. Right. Could you say a little bit?
Sure. Well, and a lot of you probably know this, but William Wyler chose Harold Russell because the Army had made a series of, many different kinds of sort of instructional films for veterans sort of coming back into civilian life, and Harold Russell was the star of one. Star sounds very odd to say, but sort of was featured in one of them called Diary of a Sergeant, in which it showed him sort of acclimating to civilian life. So these films would be shown in auditoriums, or they'd be shown in libraries or in churches to people in all across the country, to kind of, as well as at VA hospitals, to kind of get a sense of what's possible. So can I brush my teeth, and can I take care of myself, and can I get a job? And so it was really meant to highlight what was possible. And William Wyler saw Russell in this film and said, this guy has incredible presence, really like both kind of endearing qualities as well as gravitas. And I think he would be great in the role of Homer, which of course he is and was recognized as such. I think that the thing that's haunting this film that no one really in the film is able to talk about, but which is so present, is the anxiety that Homer clearly feels, not just about getting a job or being a husband, but about performing. The thing that haunts all three of them is this sense of, how do I go back to a world where there's all these expectations of me as husband, boyfriend, potential husband in Homer's case. And I think we see him take her upstairs to his bedroom and shows how he is undressed. And in that way, that also is a kind of metonym for what may happen after their wedding night. And the anxiety that all of them have, and the different characters in the film who kind of are either commenting on or are aware of the kind of fragile masculinity, right? That Sergeant Fred is reduced to selling perfume, mm-hmm, at the department, and the kind of struggle that Al has, where he has to kind of be a good banker, a good capitalist, but at the same time he knows that those guys don't really care about the status of veterans. And he has to kind of remind them, but of course he has to get very drunk in order to be able to do it. So I think that Homer's rehabilitation, Homer's status in the film kind of sheds light on all of them, but that's not to say that he doesn't have his own struggles. That's not to say that he's just a big metaphor for what's going on in the film. His struggle is both about acceptance of himself, but also about trying to insist that he be seen on his own terms and not just as some, pathetic figure who always has to be chased around, and that he lights, the cigarettes of everyone at the very beginning of the film, is kind of a very quick way for William Wyler to telegraph, don't feel sorry for this guy. He knows exactly what he's doing and he's in control. Whether or not he's able to kind of absorb that as a lesson for himself as he moves forward, that's something that it's gonna be played out. But that very quick action with the the flick of the match is sort of lets us know what Wyler's relationship to him is.
I thought it was really interesting that he is such a natural actor also. And I would suggest when you see the movie the next time that you take a look at a couple of things. For instance, so I was watching how he was using his prostheses and seeing how real it was compared to how they're really used. And you'll notice that the hooks on his right hand are coated with rubber. The hooks on his left hand are still metal, which means that one has traction and one is slippery. So he does different tasks with different hooks. When he takes the arms off, he can take the left arm off. It's not attached with straps, which means that he can't open the hook on his own. So in order to open the hook on that side, he has to use his other hand.
I was going to say, Anita, can you just tell for people who don't know how these things work,
Sure,
how someone who uses these hooks, how it works?
I can't do it without my hands, though. So the prosthesis on the right side, the hook opens so that you can grab onto things. And it has a wrist joint that you can move with the other hand, so you can put it in different positions so that when you're opening and closing the hook, it can be in different positions for you. And the way that opens and closes is through the series of straps that attaches to the other side. So as he draws his shoulders together, that force opens that hook, which means that his right side he can manage by himself, but the left side is more dependent, so he uses his right hand to open the hook and to manage things. But I thought it was interesting, like when he was smoking a cigarette, he was holding the cigarette in his left hand, and that's because if any of you have been smokers in the past, when you put the cigarette in your mouth, you kind of turn it a little bit, and you want it to be able to slide. And so in order to do that, he uses the hook that's slippery. I thought the other thing that just seems to be coming around now in the field of disability studies and disability rights is the idea of interdependence versus independence. And while independence is crucial, the idea really is that none of us really cares for ourselves independently. We all rely on each other. And this idea of, can you help me with this and I will help you with that, is really what's being talked about and expressed, so that people who do have certain abilities, like lighting the match and lighting the cigarette, he does that, and he does that with pride. And what he's trying to figure out is how to ask for help. How do I ask my girlfriend, who's going to be my wife, to be my babysitter? And how do I make those even? How do I keep my self-esteem and still need assistance from other people, which is really complicated.
Especially given how much emphasis there was in that period where there are rehabilitation manuals and all other kinds of documents put out by either rehab hospitals or the VA or the Department of Defense saying, you have to learn to manage on your own. Do not depend on anyone else. And so the idea that you would either ask for help or even show that maybe it's a production between several people, and there's no weakness or there's no stigma attached to that, but actually that's a way to live in the world. American culture tends to be one of the few that emphasizes so much about being completely independent. We even see that now with the kinds of homes that are being built for disabled vets of Iraq and Afghanistan, so that they should be able to just not have to rely on anybody. But in other parts of the world and in lots of parts of the culture, to be able to have kind of several people with whom you kind of share the tasks of doing things, that's how you get through life. It's not a weakness, it's actually a strength to be able to have a number of people who help you with getting through the day.
Yeah, and I think the important thing now is that people need to have choice. so that there's some agency in what they control and what they pass along to other people. And in our culture, it's still really economic based. So that if there's something that you can't do, it's okay to pay somebody for it, but it's still not acceptable to ask somebody for help and to receive help. And I think going forward that's where the community is also going.
Yeah, one of the things that brings up is just this idea that I wanted to talk to you both about, which is that, there is this norm of able-bodiedness that we all exist in, and that's something to strive for, that I think this film shows, is that culturally that's like, it's sort of not thought about as like, oh, of course, everybody just has to learn how to adjust to this world that we live in, and that is also a construction, right? I mean, that's not how the world is, like, on its own. And I wanted to ask you about this term that I learned about, but I know other people know about, called CRIP, that I learned by reading Sonara Taylor's book, Beasts of Burden. If any of you have read it, I really recommend it. And she calls out the category of disability as, a social construction, which she says has had perhaps fewer opportunities than other minority groups to develop an identity and a culture. And the word crip, which comes from crippled, she calls out as a word that's invested with disability, history, politics, and pride, while simultaneously questioning paradigms of independence, normalcy, and medicalization. So I'm curious, Anita, for you, how you engage in the social construction of disability in your work.
Yeah, I come around things and go back and forth where I'm coming from, because I do come from the medical community. So it's hard and easy for me to maintain that. I think that the way that I think about things is that each of us has a talent and an interest and an expertise, and in order for anything to get done, it takes people with a variety of different backgrounds. So to talk with extremists, so medical personnel who think that the answer is a cure, anything less than a cure is failure, to the opposite end with, we could look at deaf culture, where deafness is the way to be and everybody else is wrong, and that people need to adapt to the deaf community instead of the other way around. I think it's all on a continuum, and I kind of go back and forth, but I again just go back to people having control over what they define as what they want to do. And I think this thing with language, I think, is wonderful, because like you're saying, with every other minority community, there is language that's okay within the community, and codes that are meant for people within the community, and other people kind of don't know what to do with it. And I think that discomfort is also a good thing to make you think about who owns this language.
I mean, we were talking before the movie started, and for a very long time, among sort of people who identify sort of in the sort of LGBT community, the idea of queer, being called queer or identifying something as queer, was seen as offensive because of the kind of history of that word. And then sort of in the context of CRIP, that it has been embraced by kind of more recent generation of disability rights activists as a way of saying, this is a word that's been applied to us and we're going to reclaim it. Yeah. And we're going to kind of reuse it and kind of turn it on its head, sort of, and embrace the stigma, I guess you would say. But I guess in terms of, these questions, like when Sonny Taylor says or declares, as lots of other people do, that disability is a social construction, I think, one of the things that she and other people are trying to make a distinction between is to say that the body has an impairment, or that, or a range of abilities, is different than this kind of category or stamp of disabled, right? Because, let's face it, everyone has a kind of range within which they operate in some normative way, and then it exceeds it. Without my glasses, I can't, move around. And lots of people who, don't even think about themselves as disabled in some like identity-based way. It's sort of how they get through the day. Maybe they need a little extra time to get up a flight of stairs or whatever it happens to be. So impairment as a kind of difference, as a different way of thinking about things than disabled, because as the example of sort of the deaf community sort of makes clear that it's not so much that disability is a kind of constant, but it really depends on the context, right? So if a deaf person is in this audience and he or she can't understand what's going on, but there is a sign language interpreter, then they're not disabled. They are able to experience things, and that would be true of someone who is blind or someone who, was unable to get through the door because there's no ramp. So environmental changes and technological innovations kind of erase the possibility that there's this category of, you're disabled and you can't move forward or you can't kind of participate. So impairment exists, but that's different than kind of this categorical kind of status of saying you're disabled and so therefore you're over there and we're over here. And I think that is sort of what she is pointing toward when she says something like disability is a social construction, that the social is actually able to absorb lots of things so that it doesn't rely on one individual to figure everything out for him or herself. So that's what the ADA is there to do, is to say, no, it's not up to you to figure out how to navigate through life, but it's actually up to the law or the built environment or society to kind of help make accommodations and adjustments so that you can be part of a larger democratic society.
Okay, I'm curious if anybody has a question that they would like to ask. Yeah, I see if you're in the middle there,
I'm wondering, I'm thinking about this film in terms of shared vulnerability and like American historical mythology, like being a country that had some foundations of predestination, Puritanism, of proving your individual worth. And I mean, like in the film, it's a drugstore cowboy. The cowboy is such a strong foundation. And to be vulnerable, especially, with that, like as a warrior, and sharing that vulnerability when it seems like, there's a level of certain, like, so we have Selfreliance, say Emerson's Selfreliance, and Melville's critique on that, of Ahab as the extremity of that. That we really do, the individual, like celebrating the individual has problems. So when even the soldiers, so like this might, this dominance. So I'm thinking about the excess of that, or even the violence of the gun. So Wilma comes on him in a gun, and that there's that fragility, the danger of that. So thinking of in a current societal state right now where we have a leader, a presidential leader, who's that excess of dominance and afraid of even showing vulnerability. So I'm just curious, in a country that operates like this, how do we approach this to reduce this danger of hyper-individualism versus what the reality is that we have shared, interdependent, shared vulnerability?
Well, in terms of the mythology question, right, this is unique. I mean, this is a 1946 film about veterans, but of course they're veterans of war. And think about all the films that would have been coming out contemporary with this, long after this, from, even before America enters into the war, formally, in 1943, that are all about, these soldiers with guns who are, attacking enemies and, racking up points, and the kind of the mythology of the soldier, which then gets, you could say, carried over into the mythology of the cowboy in the 1950s and TV. And this is about these men whose solidarity is forged, and the vulnerability, which is not just with their girlfriends and wives and family members, but even among themselves, that they're able to talk about things with each other, and that their bonding sort of in a way requires them to all converge at butches and not just have a drink, but also to be next to each other. This kind of shared experience that is very hard to translate to anyone. I mean, so you can have your wife, your kids, your girlfriend, but they will not necessarily ever be able to translate that, when you want solidarity, brotherhood, fellowship, whatever, to other people. And that's something that this is rather radical about this film, that you can show it's not just and how do they negotiate being tough guys and family men and all that. It's actually about how do you integrate back into a world where American culture expects you to be strong individual men, but actually the strength that you've just experienced in war comes from the shared experiences with other men. That is maybe the hardest thing to integrate. So in a way, it's turning the mythology upside down of what a strong man is supposed to be. This is not the Marlboro Man. This is not those kind of stereotypes of the cowboy. It's about being fragile with each other, not just, with their wives and girlfriends behind closed doors.
And only through that are they then able to move forward with those lives.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Which maybe goes back to what you were saying, Anita, in terms of living, I'm not going to say the right word, but existing on a spectrum of interdependence.
I think also with that it's still in 2019, it still hasn't really become about the intersections of everything that people are. So although there were disabled people and non-disabled people in the film, everybody was white. The men had male roles, the women had female roles, and there was really no discussion. So I wonder what a similar film would be like now, where you talk about gender identity, when you talk about race, when you talk about religion, when you talk about ageism, when you talk about all these other things that people are now paying attention to, and then disability is overlapped over that, and it's hard to tease out what's disability, what's race, what's religion, what's gender, and it's just a big bowl of spaghetti, and everybody has to figure it out for themselves.
There was a black woman cleaning up in the woman.
Yeah.
Sorry. Also in the role that
2
was.
seconds.
Yeah.
That's right.
Okay, I think I saw a hand up there. Yeah.
I'm curious, in the 70-plus years since this movie was made, what the technological development is of the hooks, so that in today's age they are more aesthetically, visually more pleasing.
Yeah, I think it goes in two directions. Lots of people who want function still use hooks because they're the most functional and easy to use. And then the advances have gone really in scientific directions towards myoelectric control, brain control over the movements of the arms. And then in the other direction is also split into two, is the realism that's in the prosthetic limbs. So hands, flesh colored is now not just beige. Flesh color comes in a variety of fleshes for the spectrum of people who have flesh to match.
Something realistic could still function like the hooks did way back when?
Some function, some are limited to function just in the fingers. The other fingers don't work. Myoelectric hands have function in all the fingers, but they're really looked at separately. Some of the best artists use the person's other hand or other body parts to make the flesh look as though it is flesh, and then it's been taken then to the next level in two ways. One, in terms of function, where the piece that the hook is called a terminal device, and there's all kinds of terminal devices, so that a carpenter can get a hammer, so that he can switch out the hammer, or she can switch out the hammer from other tools, so that there are other functional uses of that terminal device. And then also in the art field, that these prosthetic limbs have become art pieces as well. And so if you look especially at some of the lower extremity prostheses, the ones that are built for speed and running and jumping really have the engineering principles built in so that they can perform. And this is where there's difficulties with performance better than what a human can do, and is it fair to compete or not compete? And then similarly with lower extremity limbs that are decorated with things that are important to the person, or become art pieces for models who are amputees in runway shows. So it's definitely changing. It's just, for me, I think it's just that it's not so common, that it's not everywhere. And you still have to kind of be in the right circle to run into these things, where I think that when people are everywhere doing what they want to do, that then there will be that equality that people are looking for.
And how far back does its development go? And the movie was 46. did the development go like 30 years before this, the invention?
Oh, further than that.
Well,
Yeah.
well, one thing I just wanted to add is that this question about, a more sort of aesthetically pleasing, a more realistic hand, people have been working on various versions of this long before 1946. You can find leather covered or wooden or metal versions of prosthetic hands going back to the 18th and 19th centuries. If you were a wealthy person 150, 200 years ago, you might have a beautifully crafted, articulated wooden hand because you weren't working. You were just a member of a, kind of genteel society, and you just had something that was realistic looking so that you could go about your daily business. Or, there's a museum piece at the Wellcome Institute in London for a pianist who lost a hand, and there are sort of little green felt pads on the end of each finger so they could play the piano. So there's been a lot of different design directions for prosthesis. But the one point that I think Anita sort of pointed to early on is that the ones that function best for the user are not necessarily the ones that we, who are not disabled, find aesthetically pleasing. So a split hook is incredibly useful. The ones that look realistic, not so much. So one choice that someone with a prosthetic hand sometimes has to decide is, do I want to do something where I can kind of accomplish tasks, or do I want to make it so that people don't look away from me? And I hope that they choose the former rather than the latter, but I guess it depends on what context you are living in.
Yeah, I see it as having the opportunity for all of it. Because if you look at somebody's shoe closet, you have 5 different pairs of sneakers for different activities.
That's
you
true.
have walking shoes that are low, you have high heels, you have sandals, you have, all these different
That's
things.
true.
So it kind of makes sense that should also be for other things.
But I think it also depends on sort of where you are economically, because some of you may know this already, but for every veteran that has access to prosthetic devices that cost hundreds of thousands of dollars, there are veterans of earlier wars or even people who sort of are living on the margins. There is a very brisk secondhand prosthetic sales on places like eBay or Etsy, because a lot of people can't afford it or they don't have insurance. So a secondhand device from an earlier generation or two someone might have to make do with because they don't have access to things. So there's like a black market of prosthetic devices for people who don't have access to the kind of more sort of cutting edge ones.
I think that's great. I think that, we all buy stuff on eBay that's used by other people, and that it's part of the charm of it. I work a lot with people who are wheelchair users, and a little bit less glamorous people who use bathroom equipment like commodes and shower seats and those sorts of things. You can't easily have secondary sales because of the liability that's associated with it. So we end up with all of this stuff that's still usable that then gets donated to third world countries or underdeveloped nations that can use it. And so I like the idea actually of having prosthetic limbs available, and I'm going to go home and look for them.
Oh yeah. So I have a couple of examples at home from eBay.
You're taking the arms out of people that need them.
No, these are definitely collector's items. Definitely collector's items. So I would not know. I can be cruel, but not that cruel.
I will just add that I think the first known prosthetic device was in ancient Egypt.
Yeah.
And it was a toe, right? A carved wooden toe. So you can look that. We can take one more question and then we'll have to wrap up. Yeah.
I have one question. What did you think of the author's perception of the lack of support for the veterans with regards to economics, getting a loan, not getting on a plane? That I found to be the overriding issue in the play, in the show, versus the disability that the one fellow had. What did you think of that?
Well, I'll just say quickly that we kind of perceive, especially because when Al gives a loan to the guy who wants to be a farmer, he is speaking in relation to the GI Bill, and the GI Bill opened up incredible doors, economic doors, home ownership doors, educational doors, unbelievable, but it did not necessarily stop lots of employers from saying, I'm not going to hire a guy like a Homer. You know, I've got all this, and this is also important to remember. This is, in 1946, the country was predominantly an industrial economy. It was not one of people sitting behind desks or, computers are 20, 30 years into the future. So a lot of people are looking at these disabled, veterans and saying, well, I feel my heart goes out to them, but we have work to do, and we can't just take a risk on these guys. So the bias against, disabled veterans was high. That scene where the kind of smarmy guy is talking to Dane Andrews saying, it would be nice to just hire all these veterans, but we need guys who don't have any psychological problems, or we need guys who aren't going to be a liability to us in some way. So the film is also very pointed. You don't think of it as a political film, but it's actually a very political film with regard to the way it's drawing attention to the treatment or mistreatment of veterans, the kind of status that some are given over others, and of course the kind of individual struggles that each one of them is experiencing. Dana Andrews' character, Fred, is a captain, very high-ranking official, and he comes back and he's no money. And he is, his subordinate is Al, who's a very wealthy banker. So the kind of status that you have in the military doesn't automatically translate into the status that you have in the civilian world. And so it's a very pointed moment when you recognize that they have roles that are not going to translate into the kind of civilian world that they're going to occupy.
I think also the one thing that's frustrating to me is that although it's changed some, it hasn't changed enough, and that the majority of people with disabilities still don't work. The majority of people with disabilities are still living below the means of the average person without disabilities. And I think that for me, it makes me angry and makes me want to do something. And where I am, I don't know if I want to do something local by helping individual people, or where it makes most sense to do something on a grander scale so that it helps populations in general.
Okay, well, with that, I want to thank Anita Perr and David Serlin and all of you so much for coming.
Thank you.